afternoon, everyone. The topic of the day, commentary on the history of slavery. But forever, the slavery did not start in the 1600s. It goes back much further. Slavery goes all the way back to the early Sumerian civilizations. For example, the Code of Hammurabi talks about slaves and how they're to be, and where war captives were forced into labor. Number one, but in essence, slavery started when one tribe go and invade and conquer another tribe, and their captives were not just prisoners of war, but they were forced into slavery. In the Bible, Leviticus 25, verse 44 to 46, talk about buying slaves from surrounding nations and owning them as property and pass them on inheritance. In Exodus 21, yes, it does state that kidnapping is punishable by death, but in that same chapter, in the chapter Exodus 25, Exodus 21, verse 20 to 25, verses 20, Exodus chapter 21, verses 20 to 25, state about that you can beat your slave because you're his property, and if they don't die within 3 days, no charges. If they knock out an eye or a teeth, you let them go. There was slavery. The Arabs enslaved Africans for thousands of years. Right? Matter of fact, Arabs enslaved Africans much longer than Europeans enslaved Africans. We can talk about the ancient Rome, ancient Greece. They were slaves there. All right. We can talk about every civilization, ancient Sumer with the Code of Hammurabi, about when the prisoners were captured in war, they were made into slaves. In Asia, when prisoners were captured in war, they were made into slaves. There's also the issue that the uh, ancient, ancient civilization of ancient Greeks, ancient Romans, they had slaves. When the Romans overrun Judea, they enslaved the Jews that were living there. There was slavery in Egypt. People were enslaved there too. The Arabs enslaved Africans for thousands of years. There was slavery in Africa. Africans tribe conquered and enslaved other African tribes for many, many decades before the Europeans came. Now, when the Europeans came, the African tribes would go around conquer other African tribes and enslave them and sold them to the Europeans. In fact, there were many African nations and African peoples, and there was a famous chief in that reside in what is now Nigeria. That was a major slave owner. There were black Americans that were slave owners, and black Africans were slave owners. And we also have the fact that it was the British that eventually outlawed slavery, and at the time they used to send ships up and down the west coast of Africa to outlaw slavery. So slavery is not a new thing. It goes back a thousand of years in ancient Sumer, ancient Egypt, in ancient Asian countries, in Greek and Roman civilizations. And when Romans overrun the land of Israel, except many of the captives were slaves, right? And there were many slave revolts to the Roman Empire. And then when they were ancient Egypt, there was slaves there. And the Arabs enslaved Africa over 1,000 years, and many horrific things after that. And the African civilization, African nations African tribes to invade and conquer the African tribes. Long before the Europeans came. When the Europeans came, they used to then just sell them to the Europeans, and they were Black Americans that were slave, that was slave owners. Going back to come to all of the the current. So in a nutshell, slavery has been around for thousands of years. Everybody um, have participated in slavery. So the thing about reparations is just basically not consistent because then, you know, everybody was over it. Ancient Greek, ancient Rome, ancient Egypt, the Arabs enslaving the Africans, Africans enslaving other Africans, Africans selling Africans into the European slave traders, and they were also Native Americans that are slaves, and on and on and on. So that's basically let's close the chapter and move on to something newer and better. All right? Thank you.